It was an ordinary evening in a small southern town where the rhythm of life seemed slow but was often marked by unspoken tensions. Lety Jackson, a respected schoolteacher and a beloved figure in her community, was walking home after a long day at work. The air was cool, and the quiet streets carried the distant hum of crickets, providing a peaceful backdrop to her thoughts. As she approached a familiar corner near her neighborhood, a patrol car suddenly pulled up beside her, its lights flashing briefly before turning off. Two white police officers stepped out, laughing and nudging each other as if sharing a private joke. Lety, startled but composed, paused and looked at them. Their smirks immediately made her uneasy. One of the officers held a writhing bag in his hand, and his partner grinned widely. "Hey there, miss," the man with the bag said, his tone casual, yet tinged with something unnerving. "We just wanted to make your evening a little more exciting." Before Lety could respond or understand what was happening, the officer opened the bag and pulled out a snake, a living, coiling creature that hissed as it caught the light of the street lamp. Without hesitation, he tossed it toward her feet. Lety screamed and stumbled backward, her purse falling to the ground as she instinctively tried to shield herself. The snake landed with a soft thud, writhing on the pavement. The officers burst into laughter, doubling over as if they'd just witnessed the punchline of a great joke. "It's just a harmless little thing," one of them managed to say between guffaws. "Relax, it's all in good fun." Her heart racing, Lety stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling as she quickly assessed her surroundings. Summoning every ounce of composure she could muster, she stepped away from the snake, which had already begun slithering off toward the grass. She bent down, picked up her purse, and turned to walk away, her head held high despite the knot of fear and anger tightening in her chest. Behind her, the officers continued to laugh, their voices echoing down the empty street. "She didn't even say thank you," one of them jeered, slapping his partner on the back. Lety didn't respond. She didn't look back. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, but she kept moving, determined not to let them see how much they had shaken her. When she finally reached the safety of her home, Lety sat down on the edge of her bed, her hands still trembling as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Little did the officers know, the man she was about to call was someone they'd never want to face. Lety Jackson sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her husband, Marcus, sat across from her, listening intently as she recounted the events of the evening. Every word she spoke brought a deeper furrow to his brow, his jaw tightening with each detail. Marcus Jackson was no ordinary man. A prominent civil rights attorney, he had made his name fighting cases where others had been silenced or ignored. He was relentless in his pursuit of justice, a man who believed in using the law as a tool to defend dignity and expose abuse of power. But at that moment, he wasn't just an attorney, he was a husband, listening to the hurt and fear in his wife's voice. Lety's voice wavered as she described the snake, the laughter, and the officer's mockery. "They didn't even care," she said, staring into her tea. "It wasn't about the snake. It was about seeing me scared. They thought it was funny." Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "They didn't know who they were messing with," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "But they're about to find out." The first step was gathering evidence. Marcus was meticulous, knowing that emotions alone wouldn't win the battle ahead. He called in a favor from a local friend who worked in the city's public works department to access footage from the street cameras near the incident. After a few hours of digging, the friend delivered exactly what Marcus needed. Clear footage of the patrol car pulling up, the officers tossing the snake, and their mocking laughter as Lety walked away. But Marcus didn't stop there. He began reaching out to community members, asking if anyone else had experienced similar behavior from the same officers. The stories came flooding in, instances of unnecessary stops, condescending remarks, and actions that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Marcus compiled each account, creating a detailed record of their patterns. Lety, meanwhile, began to find her own strength in the midst of the storm. Encouraged by Marcus, she agreed to speak to a local reporter who had covered cases of police misconduct in the past. Her story wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about the larger issue of accountability. Her words were calm but powerful, and when the article was published, it struck a chord in the community. As the evidence mounted, Marcus filed an official complaint with the police department, demanding an internal investigation into the officers' actions. He didn't stop there. He also prepared a civil suit against the department for their failure to ensure that officers upheld the standards of their duty. The town buzzed with the news. Some people were shocked by what had happened, while others were unsurprised, their own experiences validating Lety's story. Marcus organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to share their concerns. The turnout was overwhelming. People who had previously been too afraid or disillusioned to speak came forward, emboldened by Lety's courage and Marcus's unwavering support. The two officers, initially dismissive of the complaint, began to feel the pressure as public scrutiny intensified. What had started as a harmless joke, in their words, had turned into a spotlight on their behavior and the culture within the department. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to build his case, ensuring that every step he took was grounded in facts and supported by evidence. He knew that what they were fighting for was bigger than just Lety. It was about setting a precedent that such actions would not go unchecked. Little by little, the tide began to turn. What the officers thought was a fleeting moment of cruelty now had the potential to reshape the system they had taken for granted. The battle was just beginning, but Marcus and Lety were ready. Together, they were determined to show that actions, no matter how small, have consequences, and that no one is above accountability. The courtroom was packed on the day the hearing began. Journalists with notepads, members of the community, and even officials from neighboring towns filled the seats. The air buzzed with anticipation as Marcus Jackson walked in, his calm demeanor masking the fire burning within him. Lety sat a few rows back, surrounded by friends and supporters, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. At the defense table sat the two officers, their confident smirks from earlier days now replaced with uneasy expressions. Their lawyer looked polished, but even he seemed slightly unsettled by the sheer weight of the case against them. Marcus had made sure this was no ordinary hearing. It was a moment of reckoning. Marcus opened the proceedings with a clear and measured tone. This case is about accountability. It's about understanding that those who are entrusted with the public's trust must hold themselves to a higher standard. What happened to my client, Mrs. Jackson, was not just a lapse in judgment. It was an abuse of authority that struck at the heart of what it means to feel safe in your own community. The defense lawyer countered by claiming the officer's actions were a harmless prank and never meant to cause real harm. But Marcus was ready. He let the defense finish before presenting his first piece of evidence, the video footage. The room fell silent as the clip played. The grainy footage showed the patrol car pulling up, the officers stepping out, and one of them tossing the snake in Lety's direction. Her startled reaction and their laughter echoed through the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the audience. The footage left no room for reinterpretation. It was clear, undeniable. Marcus called Lety to the stand first. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she recounted the events of that night. I was walking home, minding my own business. They didn't stop me to ask questions or to help, no. They stopped to laugh at me, to scare me for their own amusement. Her words resonated with the jury, but Marcus knew he needed more than just her testimony. He called forward other members of the community who had experienced similar encounters with the same officers. One by one, they spoke. A young man who was stopped and mocked for his clothes, an elderly woman who was berated for asking for directions, a teenager who had been unnecessarily searched. Each story painted a picture of a pattern, a culture of carelessness and disregard. The defense tried to discredit the witnesses, but Marcus was ready with corroborating evidence, timestamps from police reports, statements from other officers, and even inconsistencies in the accused officer's own records. When it was the officers' turn to testify, their confidence had visibly eroded. They stumbled over their explanations, claiming they didn't think it would be taken so seriously and that it was just a spur-of-the-moment decision. Marcus seized the moment. You are sworn to protect and serve. Is scaring a woman with a snake your idea of protection? Was your laughter part of the service you're meant to provide? His questions cut through their defenses like a knife. The officers had no answers, and their lawyers' attempts to salvage their case only highlighted their lack of justification. By the end of their testimonies, it was clear they had underestimated the impact of their actions and Marcus's determination. In his closing argument, Marcus spoke directly to the jury. What happened to Mrs. Jackson is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue, one that we as a community must address. But today is about more than punishment. It's about sending a message that behavior like this will not be tolerated. It's about ensuring that the next person walking home won't have to live in fear of those meant to protect them. The defense lawyer tried to downplay the case, calling it an overreaction, but the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence, the testimonies, and the sheer weight of the community's support for Lety and Marcus were impossible to ignore. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The officers were found liable for their actions. They were ordered to pay damages to Lety and were suspended from the police force pending further investigation. The department itself faced scrutiny for its lack of oversight, with promises of reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. When the verdict was read, a wave of relief and pride swept through the courtroom. Lety smiled for the first time in days, tears streaming down her face as Marcus leaned over to squeeze her hand. Justice had been served. The case didn't just bring accountability, it brought change. The local police department implemented mandatory training to address misconduct, and a civilian oversight committee was established to monitor future complaints. Marcus and Lety's story inspired others to come forward with their experiences, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond their small town. For Marcus and Lety, the fight had been personal, but its impact was far-reaching. Together, they proved that standing up for what's right, even in the face of fear, can lead to meaningful change. As they walked out of the courtroom that day, hand in hand, they knew their journey had only just begun. The sun was setting as Marcus and Lety Jackson left the courthouse hand in hand. The weight of the trial had lifted, replaced by a mix of relief and triumph. As they walked through the crowd gathered outside, cheers erupted. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed the case surrounded them, offering congratulations, hugs, and words of gratitude. For the Jacksons, this moment wasn't just a victory for themselves, it was a victory for the entire community. The officers involved in the incident, who had once laughed openly about their actions, now faced the consequences of their behavior. Following the jury's verdict, the local police department suspended them without pay, pending an internal investigation. The civil suit's outcome also spurred broader questions about how the department had allowed such incidents to occur unchecked. In the weeks that followed, the two officers publicly apologized in an effort to mitigate the backlash, but their words were met with skepticism. "I didn't realize it would be taken this way," one of them said during a televised interview. The response from the public was swift, with many pointing out that their regret seemed less about their actions and more about being caught. For the Jacksons, no apology could erase the trauma, but they chose to focus on the progress the case had sparked, rather than dwell on the past. "It's not about them anymore," Marcus said in an interview. "It's about what happens next, for this town and for people everywhere." The trial sent shockwaves through the town, igniting a wave of activism and reform. Community leaders organized forums to discuss systemic issues within the police department. The mayor, feeling the pressure from the public and media, announced sweeping changes, including the creation of a civilian oversight committee. This group would review complaints against law enforcement and work to rebuild trust between the community and the police. Additionally, mandatory training programs were introduced for all officers, focusing on professional conduct and community engagement. The department's new chief publicly vowed to prioritize accountability and transparency moving forward. These changes were a direct result of the attention the Jacksons' case had brought to the town. Their bravery inspired others to come forward with their own stories, breaking a long-standing silence and fostering a sense of collective empowerment. For Lety, the journey wasn't just about winning a court case, it was about reclaiming her sense of safety and dignity. While she had always been a strong and composed person, the incident had shaken her deeply. The support she received from her community played a crucial role in her healing. She resumed her teaching with a renewed sense of purpose, using her experience to teach her students about courage and standing up for what is right. Her classroom became a place where young minds were encouraged to discuss fairness, justice, and the importance of empathy. Lety also found solace in her faith. She joined a local women's group that focused on healing and community service. Together, they started initiatives to support others who had experienced similar struggles, offering a safe space for sharing and growth. For Marcus, the case was just one battle in a larger war. The success of Lety's case amplified his reputation as a tireless advocate for justice, bringing more cases his way. He used the attention to highlight broader issues and push for systemic change not only in their town, but also in surrounding communities. He often reflected on how personal this fight had been, how it had challenged him to balance his roles as a lawyer, a husband, and a community leader. But it also reinforced his belief in the power of the law as a tool for change. This wasn't just about winning a case, he often said. It was about showing that when people come together and refuse to stay silent, real change is possible. The Jackson story became a symbol of hope and resilience, spreading far beyond their small town. News outlets picked up the story, and it sparked discussions about accountability in other parts of the country. Their names became synonymous with courage, and their actions inspired others to confront injustices in their own communities. 1 year after the trial, the Jacksons hosted a community event called Voices United, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their stories and discuss ways to build a better, fairer town. The event drew hundreds of attendees and marked the beginning of an annual tradition aimed at fostering understanding and solidarity. As they stood on the stage at the event, Marcus spoke to the crowd. "We didn't choose to be in this fight," he said, his voice steady, "but we chose to face it. And because of that choice, we stand here today, not just as a family, but as a community, stronger than ever." Lety, standing beside him, added, "When we act with courage and compassion, we create ripples that grow beyond anything we can imagine. Together, we've proven that no one has to stand alone." The Jacksons' lives gradually returned to a new normal, but the impact of their fight continued to ripple outward. Their town became a beacon of progress, demonstrating that even in the face of adversity, change is possible when people stand together. For Marcus and Lety, the fight for justice was never about seeking recognition. It was about building a future where such battles would no longer be necessary. And though they would never forget the night that started it all, they chose to focus on the light that had emerged from the darkness. A community united, a system challenged, and a legacy of hope that would inspire generations to come.